They said she was wasting her money. A 64-year-old woman, a former nurse, spending $71,000 on an abandoned lighthouse no one wanted. They called her lonely, delusional, said, "That place is beyond saving." But what Helen Montgomery did with that lighthouse didn't just shock the town, it brought people back to life. This isn't just a story about rusted walls and broken glass. It's about a female lighthouse keeper who turned silence into sanctuary and gave a second chance to everyone who had nowhere left to go. Stay with us. You won't believe what this light uncovered. Let's get started. They say some people see what others overlook. That was certainly true for Helen Montgomery, a soft-spoken woman in her early 60s who had spent most of her life repairing broken things, not just furniture or fences, but people too. After retiring from her job as a hospice nurse, she packed up her life in Ohio and moved to the foggy little coastal town of Port Orford, Oregon population. 100 on a good day. It wasn't a place you'd find on postcards. The beach was rocky, the buildings were tired, and the only real landmark was an abandoned lighthouse standing crooked at the edge of a wind-swept cliff. Most folks called it an eyesore. Some said it was cursed. But Helen, she called it home. She paid $71,000 in cash for it, every penny she had from her pension and the sale of her late mother's house. And when the townspeople found out, they chuckled over their coffee cups. She bought that old ghost tower, bless her heart. Someone should have stopped her. But Helen wasn't after beauty. She wasn't after views. She was after something else entirely. And what she found hidden inside would bring an entire town to tears. At first, people in Port Orford thought she was just lonely. A widow, perhaps, or maybe a wanderer chasing fog and ghosts. No one really knew Helen Montgomery, and truth be told, most didn't try. She wasn't rude, just quiet, the kind of woman who politely declined invitations but always waved back from across the street. The townsfolk had seen her wandering up the rocky trail to the lighthouse each morning. Rain or shine, carrying a worn leather satchel and a thermos of coffee. She'd unlock the heavy iron door, disappear inside for hours, then return before dusk. Clothes smudged with dirt and rust, hair tucked neatly under a faded green scarf. "She's trying to fix it," one man said at the hardware store. What for another replied, "That thing's been dead longer than half the folks buried in the old cemetery." But Helen didn't fix things for show. She never had. Inside the lighthouse, time had stopped. The floors creaked with secrets. Sea salt had eaten away at the stairs. The lantern room was shattered, long since dark, and most of the walls were blanketed in graffiti and mold. But Helen moved through it like someone walking through a memory. Weeks passed, then a month. The rumors died down, replaced by a kind of quiet curiosity. One Sunday, a group of teenagers hiked up the trail and peeked inside. They expected to find cobwebs, maybe even a dead bird or two. What they saw instead stopped them cold. The interior had changed. The floors were scrubbed clean. Broken glass had been swept away. Rusted fixtures were polished back to life. And right in the center of the main chamber stood a large wooden chest, its lid slightly open, revealing dozens of worn letters inside neatly stacked, tied with string. One of the teens whispered, "Is this some kind of museum?" Another replied, "I think she's restoring it." They didn't touch anything. They just stood there. Then quietly left. By the following weekend, word had spread. That's when the questions started. What's she doing up there? Where'd she even get the tools? Why would she spend all that money on something no one wants to look at? And one woman, Grace, the town librarian, asked the only question that mattered. What if it's not about the lighthouse at all? One foggy morning, Grace packed a thermos of tea and walked up to the lighthouse. She knocked gently. No answer. She knocked again. Still nothing. But just as she turned to leave, the heavy door creaked open. Helen stood there, eyes cautious but kind. "May I come in?" Grace asked softly. Helen hesitated for a moment, then nodded. They sat in silence for a while. Grace didn't ask questions. Helen didn't offer explanations. But slowly, words found their way. "This place," Helen began, "is the last thing my father ever loved." She reached into her satchel and pulled out an old, black and white photo. It showed a man in a Coast Guard uniform standing proudly in front of the same lighthouse. Decades ago. He was stationed here in 1965, said it was the loneliest post on the coast, but the most honest work he'd ever done. Grace leaned in. After the war, he came back here. Alone. He didn't have much, but he had this light. He wrote letters to my mother every week from this tower. Letters she kept. All of them. Helen's voice cracked. She died before she could show them to me. I found them last year, hidden in a box under her bed. Suddenly, the pieces clicked. This wasn't just a renovation. It was a resurrection. Helen wasn't fixing the lighthouse. She was restoring a memory, rebuilding a love story that had faded with time and tide. From that day on, something shifted in Port Orford. The judgment disappeared, replaced by quiet awe. People began stopping by not to gossip, but to help. Someone dropped off a box of brushes. Another offered a new pane of glass for the lantern room. The local high school sent 2 students to help repaint the stairwell. The town historian brought archival photos from the 1960s. And Helen, though still quiet, began to smile more. One afternoon, she posted a note on the community board at the general store. Opening day, the Lightkeeper's Letters, a memory exhibit inside the restored Port Orford Lighthouse Saturday, 10 Free to all. No one knew what to expect. But when Saturday came, over 100 people gathered along the cliffside path, young and old, tourists and locals, some who hadn't stepped foot in the lighthouse since childhood. Inside, the walls were lined with framed letters, each one carefully chosen from her father's collection. Each letter told a story of fear, of longing, of hope, of storms weathered, of nights spent alone, staring at a lantern light waiting for dawn, of a man who gave everything to keep others safe, and a woman who waited for him with love as steady as the sea. People didn't just read them, they wept. Not because the letters were sad, but because they were true. By sunset, someone placed a single rose on the threshold of the lighthouse, then another, and another. By nightfall, the doorway was covered in flowers. And for the first time in nearly 50 years, the lantern atop the Port Orford Lighthouse flickered on a soft, golden glow that swept across the town below. It didn't light the ocean anymore, but it lit something else, Remembrance. And in that light, Port Orford saw Helen Montgomery not as a strange outsider, but as a woman who had brought something sacred back to life. After the exhibit opened, the lighthouse became something no one expected, a place of quiet pilgrimage. People came not just from Port Orford, but from nearby towns, even as far as Eugene and Portland. They came to read the letters. Some brought their kids. Some came alone, standing in silence for long minutes in front of a single note dated October 18th, 1966. The town started calling it the Lighthouse of Love. Helen never once called it that herself. But she didn't correct anyone, either. Each morning, she lit a candle near her father's framed photograph at the entrance. A small ritual, simple and reverent. She had finally found peace, until the envelope arrived. It was tucked between a stack of mail at the general store, where Helen still picked up her letters by hand. The envelope was yellowed, its edges frayed, and the handwriting unmistakable. Her mother's The address on it wasn't hers, but the name was, and taped to the front was a note from the current owner of her mother's old home in Ohio. "Dear Ms. Montgomery, we found this tucked behind a floorboard while renovating. It was sealed and addressed to you. Figured it might be important?" Helen's hands trembled as she peeled it open. Inside was a single sheet, folded carefully. The ink had faded, but the words struck her like a thunderclap. "Helen, if you found the lighthouse, then you've likely found the letters. I need to tell you something. Your father didn't die in the service. He didn't go down with the ship like they said. He left. He left us. Not for another woman or another life, but because he believed he wasn't worthy of staying. I told you he died because it was easier to honor a ghost than face the truth of a man who gave up. But you're braver than I ever was. If you're reading this, then maybe you've forgiven him more than I ever could. And if so, I hope you find him. Mom." Helen didn't remember walking back home that day, only the pounding of her heart and the deafening sound of silence. For days, she didn't return to the lighthouse. People noticed. Visitors left confused. The candles weren't lit. The door remained locked. The townspeople whispered, unsure what had happened. Some said Helen had gotten sick. Others thought she'd moved away. But Grace, the librarian, knew better. She knocked on Helen's door 3 times before it opened. "You don't look well," Grace said gently. Helen just handed her the letter. And Grace, ever the listener, ever the quiet companion, didn't try to explain it away. She just sat beside her and read it twice. "Do you want to take them down?" she asked. "The letters," Helen whispered. Grace nodded. "No," Helen said, voice barely audible. "They still mattered, even if the man behind them wasn't who I thought." And then, after a long pause, "But there's one more letter I need to write." The next morning, Helen opened the lighthouse again. People trickled in slowly, unsure of what they'd find. To their surprise, something new had been added. In the center of the room, on a small wooden stand, was a final letter handwritten, signed by Helen herself. No frame, no glass, just paper and truth. "To the man I once called father, I used to think the lighthouse was yours, that the light it held was a symbol of your strength, your honor. Now I know the truth. It wasn't yours. It was mine all along. You may have left the service. You may have left us. But I won't leave this. Because healing doesn't come from hiding. It comes from facing what hurts and choosing to stand in the light anyway. So today, I reclaim this place not as a monument to your memory, but as a home for people like me, for those carrying letters too heavy to hold, for those who've lost, been lied to, or left behind. This is not your lighthouse anymore. It's everyone's." Some cried as they read it. Others stood in silence, holding their partner's hand. One man, a veteran himself, left his own medal beside the stand before walking out without a word. That evening, a boy who had never spoken a word in public tugged on Helen's coat and asked if he could light the candle that night. She knelt beside him and handed him the match. And together, they watched the flame rise. The story changed after that. No longer just a love story, no longer just nostalgia. It became something raw and real about disappointment, betrayal, forgiveness, and choice. People didn't just visit the lighthouse now. They confessed in it. They brought ashes of loved ones, letters never sent, rings that never found fingers, journals, prayers. Helen didn't become famous. She didn't want to. But she became something rarer. Trusted. In the quiet town of Port Orford, where fog still rolled in each morning and the waves still struck the cliffs with ancient rhythm, the lighthouse no longer stood forgotten. It stood claimed. And at its heart was a woman who paid $71,000 for a broken tower, only to find that what was truly broken wasn't the lighthouse at all. By spring, the tides had shifted not just along the Oregon coast, but in the hearts of the people who called Port Orford home. The lighthouse, once a forgotten shell of history, had become the town's quiet center. But it wasn't just about what it looked like, or even the story of the love letters anymore. It was about what it had become. A place where people laid down what they'd carried for too long. And yet, no one changed more than Helen Montgomery. For most of her life, she had been the one in the background, the caregiver, the nurse, the daughter who stayed silent while others decided what should be remembered and what should be buried. But the letter from her mother, that painful, honest letter, had cracked something open inside her. For the first time in decades, she wasn't just holding the pain of others. She was holding her own. Helen began spending her mornings not just cleaning or curating, but writing. In a small corner room of the lighthouse, where salty air slipped through the window frame and the seagulls cried like ghosts, she kept a journal. Not the kind you lock away, but one left open on a table for anyone to read. Reflections from the keeper. It was called. Each day, she wrote a new entry. Simple, honest, sometimes just a sentence. Today, a man brought his father's fishing knife. He cried. I did too. Forgiveness isn't loud. Sometimes it's just not slamming the door. I thought I came here to finish a story. I think I'm finally ready to begin one. Visitors began leaving entries of their own. Over time, the journal turned into a kind of living conversation between strangers, between past and present, pain and healing. And the town was watching. At the diner, where people once mocked Helen's decision to buy the lighthouse, her name now came with a tone of respect, even reverence. One elderly man who had once said, "She's just a lost lady looking for ghosts," now left fresh flowers at the lighthouse door every Sunday, never saying a word. No, a teenager who'd been caught shoplifting a year earlier started volunteering after school, quietly sweeping the stairs and repairing broken picture frames. Even the mayor, once too busy to care about old buildings on cliffs, now brought out-of-town guests to the site and called it our town's heart. But the most profound change wasn't in what people did. It was in what they shared. Stories came pouring in. One woman brought a shoebox full of unsent letters to her sister, lost to cancer. A war veteran laid down his medals and whispered, "I'm tired of holding on to guilt." A mother left a journal entry that read, "I never got to meet my son, but today, I feel like he heard me anyway." Helen didn't offer advice. She didn't preach. She just kept the light on. And in doing so, she became something she never expected to be. A keeper, not of boats, not of history, but of pain, of memory, of healing. One afternoon, Grace the librarian and Helen's closest companion in Port Orford asked a question neither had dared say aloud before. "Do you ever wish you hadn't found the letters?" Helen looked out toward the sea, where the waves crashed against the rocks like steady thunder. "Sometimes," she said honestly, "sometimes I wish I never knew. But then I remember," she continued, "that truth doesn't break us. Hiding from it does." There was silence. Then she added, "If I hadn't opened those letters, I'd still be grieving a man who never existed. But now, I grieve what could have been. And somehow, that feels more honest." The town began to mirror that honesty. At the town hall meeting that June, Port Orford passed a motion to make the lighthouse a protected heritage site, not because of its architecture, but because of its impact. The local school district began organizing field trips to the site, where students would learn not just about maritime history, but emotional literacy, how to process grief, how to forgive, how to remember with tenderness. A plaque was placed at the entrance of the lighthouse. It read, "In honor of those who carry untold stories and the lightkeepers who help them let go." Helen never expected any of this. She never wanted praise. But something strange happened the day that plaque went up. She sat on the old wooden bench just outside the lighthouse, watching the last few visitors leave. And for the first time in her life, she felt seen. Not pitied, not needed, not admired for her strength or her resilience. Just seen as she was. A woman who didn't come to fix a lighthouse, but to fix a part of herself she never knew was broken. That evening, as the sky melted into watercolor pinks and soft gold, she climbed to the top of the lantern room, now fully restored. She lit the beacon one more time, even though ships no longer passed by this stretch of coast. And she stood there, with the wind in her face, whispering to no one in particular, "I'm still here. Not because I stayed strong, but because I finally let it hurt." In a world full of stories about heroes who conquer mountains, Helen Montgomery's story was quieter but no less powerful. She didn't conquer anything. She opened the door, cleaned the dust, and let the light in. The wind never really stops in Port Orford. It rolls in from the Pacific like a living thing, brushing across the cliffside, rattling window panes, and reminding everyone that nature, like time, never stands still. But something else had begun moving too. A quiet ripple, spreading from that old lighthouse on the edge of town. It started one afternoon, when a teacher from the local middle school knocked on Helen's door. Her name was Miss Larkin, and she looked nervous, like she wasn't sure this was a good idea. "I was wondering," she began, "if maybe we could bring some of our students up next week. Some of them are dealing with stuff, home, anxiety. You know, I just thought maybe they'd feel something here, the way the rest of us did." Helen blinked. No one had ever asked her for something like that before. But she smiled softly and said, "Yes, of course. I'd be honored." That Friday, 12 students made their way up the trail, most dragging their feet, headphones on, too cool for anything old. But when they entered the lighthouse, something shifted. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic. It was just stillness. For some of these kids, it was the first time they'd ever heard silence without fear. Helen didn't give a lecture. She didn't force them to talk. She simply lit the lantern in the corner, not the giant beacon, but a smaller, warm oil lamp, and placed it in the middle of the room. "This light has been passed down," she said, "from a man who kept it burning, to a woman who carried its memory, and now to all of you." Then she placed an old wooden box beside it, filled with folded pieces of paper. "These," she explained, "are letters people have written but never sent. You don't have to read them, but if you want to write your own, there's paper on the desk." At first, no one moved. But then, quietly, one did. A boy named Jonah, whose father had died last year. He picked up a pen, sat down, and didn't look up for 20 minutes. When he finished, he folded the note, placed it in the box, and whispered, "Thank you." That day, everything changed. Word spread. The lighthouse became more than an exhibit. It became a sanctuary. Soon, Helen was hosting groups every weekend. Veterans from nearby shelters, women from a domestic violence safe house, teenagers recovering from self-harm, foster youth, quiet and wide-eyed, holding hands like they were afraid to let go. Helen never claimed to be a therapist. She didn't try to fix anyone. She simply kept the place clean, kept the light burning, kept the space safe. And slowly, the lighthouse became something even the Coast Guard couldn't have imagined. A beacon not for ships, but for souls. The town began leaning in. The bakery started donating warm rolls and muffins on group days. The hardware store sent 2 volunteers to build benches outside. A retired Marine once known for being gruff and closed off painted the fence white and quietly left a note inside the journal. "I thought I was the only one carrying ghosts. Turns out, I'm not." Then came the letter from the State Historical Society. It wasn't just a preservation grant, it was an offer. We'd like to recognize the Port Orford Lighthouse not only as a historical site, but as a modern-day model for community healing. Would you be willing to speak at our annual gathering in Salem?" Helen stared at the letter for hours, not because she didn't want to go, but because she never thought anyone would ask her to speak. The night before the event, she sat at the base of the lighthouse, legs curled under her, journal in hand. Grace came and sat beside her, offering no words, just presence. After a long pause, Helen finally said, "Do you know what I used to think this place was?" "A grave," Grace whispered. Helen nodded. "But it's not anymore. It's a beginning, for so many people, including me." The speech was short, barely 5 minutes. But people remembered it more than the keynote. "We all carry broken pieces," she said. "Sometimes they don't make sense. Sometimes they feel too heavy. But when we place them in the right hands, they become light. And sometimes, that's all someone needs. A little light." Applause didn't explode. It rose gently like the tide at dawn. When Helen returned home, she found something on her porch, a small wooden crate. Inside were dozens of envelopes from people who'd visited the lighthouse, but never had the courage to leave their letters in the box. Now they were sending them back. "I finally forgave him. I left that job. I'm starting over. I showed this place to my mom. She cried for the first time in years." Helen read each one, then placed them gently in a drawer marked New Light. Port Orford had changed. It was still small, still foggy, still rough around the edges. But now it had something it never had before. A place people drove hours to find. A woman who'd become a keeper of more than just a lighthouse. And a box full of pain, folded into hope, letter by letter, hand by hand. Helen often said she didn't rebuild the lighthouse. "I just listened to it. It had been waiting all this time, for someone to love it back to life." There was one letter Helen had never read. It sat at the bottom of the chest she'd brought from Ohio, a faded blue envelope with no return address. Sealed tight and brittle with time. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was her father's. She had seen the envelope 100 times, always choosing to pass over it. She didn't know why, maybe fear, maybe anger, or maybe because part of her believed she didn't need to know what was inside. But on the morning of her 64th birthday, as rain battered the lighthouse windows and the sea roared like an old lion, she finally picked it up. Her hands shook as she broke the seal. Inside were just 4 short lines, scribbled hastily on lined paper. "Helen, if you're reading this, then I failed twice, once as a father, and once as a man. But I pray the light I left behind is enough to guide you home. Forgive me, Dad." She didn't cry at first. She just sat still, the letter in her lap, the old sea wind pressing against the glass. But then, something in her cracked. Not a dramatic sob, just a slow, quiet ache rising from her chest, spilling out like the tide. She wasn't mourning her father's death. She was mourning the girl who had waited her entire life to be chosen by him. And finally, she understood he didn't leave because he stopped loving them. He left because he didn't believe he deserved to be loved. That afternoon, she did something she hadn't done in years. She drove down to the cemetery, not the town's main one, but the smaller, older one, tucked behind the chapel near the cliffs. There was no headstone for her father there, but she brought a stone anyway. A simple rock from the shore, smooth and dark. On it, she wrote, "You were afraid. I forgive you, but I am not afraid anymore." And she placed it among the others, where no one would ever know the meaning but her. The next day, something happened that shook her in a different way. A woman named Lara, no older than 30, showed up at the lighthouse with a baby in her arms and tears already in her eyes. She'd driven 3 hours from Coos Bay after hearing about the lighthouse on a blog post titled, "Where Light Still Lives." "I left my husband 2 weeks ago," she said quietly, rocking the child. "He never hit me. But the words, they broke parts of me I didn't know could break. I didn't know where to go. I just needed somewhere to not feel crazy." Helen welcomed her inside, gave her tea, held the baby so Lara could cry. And then something unexpected happened. Lara asked if she could stay. Just for a night? Helen hesitated. The lighthouse had never been a shelter. But she looked into Lara's tired eyes and realized neither had she. And yet here they both were. 1 night became 2. 2 became a week. Helen made up a small room in the old keeper's quarters. Lara helped sweep, made soup, wrote letters she never mailed. And little by little, a bond formed between 2 women, one at the end of a long road, one at the beginning of a new one. Helen had spent her life caring for the dying. Now, she was learning how to care for the living without losing herself. Soon after, others came, not to stay overnight, but to sit, to listen, to ask if maybe, just maybe, they could speak to Helen one-on-one. She never called it counseling. She never charged a dime. But the townspeople began calling her something new. The keeper of the broken. She laughed the first time she heard it. "I'm broken too," she replied. "Exactly," said Grace. "That's why they trust you." But with the growth came new pain. One evening, she found a note tucked under the lighthouse door. "Not everyone needs a sad lady and her therapy tower. Why don't you leave the past buried?" There was no name, no return address. And for the first time in months, Helen felt the weight of what she'd built press heavy on her shoulders. She stared at the note for a long time. Then, slowly, she burned it, watched the ashes float into the cold night air. Then she walked up to the lantern room and lit the beacon. It wasn't about proving anything. It was simply a reminder to herself, and to anyone watching, that darkness doesn't get to win. The next day, Lara handed Helen a folded piece of paper. It was a poem. She lit a light she didn't own. "But now we come when we're alone, not to be fixed or told to cope, but just to sit in borrowed hope." Helen read it twice, then hugged Lara tighter than she'd hugged anyone in years. Something had changed in Helen. Not just her role, not just her reputation, but her heart. She no longer flinched at kindness. She no longer minimized her worth. She had learned to receive, not just to give. To be seen, to be held, to be loved, not for what she could do, but simply for who she was. That evening, she opened her journal and wrote the simplest entry yet. "I used to be a nurse. Now, I'm a lighthouse. And I think I finally know the difference." By autumn, something had shifted in Port Orford. The town didn't suddenly boom with tourists. The fishing boats still groaned at dawn. The grocery store still ran out of milk on Mondays. But the town felt different, warmer somehow. More awake. And at the edge of the cliff, the lighthouse stood no longer just a relic of the past, but a living monument to something deeper. A woman's quiet decision to believe healing was possible for others, and for herself. Helen Montgomery had never asked for attention. But her story had begun to travel not by headlines or documentaries, but through whispers and hearts. People left the lighthouse and went home different. They told their families, their neighbors, their journals, and somewhere along the way, someone started calling it the lighthouse that listens. One November morning, Helen received a letter in the mail. No stamp, no return address, just a single line inside. "You saved my life. You'll never know how, but you did." She folded it gently and placed it in the new light drawer. It joined hundreds of others. A few weeks later, something extraordinary happened. The town council voted unanimously to rename the surrounding parkland. Montgomery Bluff. At first, Helen protested. "I'm not the one who built it," she said, blushing. But Grace only smiled. "No, you rebuilt it, and you rebuilt us, too." Winter came, not the harsh, biting kind, but the soft kind. The kind that made tea taste sweeter and made the light from inside homes glow just a little warmer. And one evening, just before Christmas, Helen decided to do something bold. She organized the town's first candlelight gathering at the Lighthouse. No formal speeches, no performances, just presents. People showed up wrapped in scarves, carrying thermoses and candles. Children laughed. Old men shuffled quietly. Even teenagers who once scoffed at the idea stood in reverent silence as the lantern was lit. Then, without a word, Helen walked to the center of the room and placed a blank notebook on the pedestal. "Tonight," she said gently. "You don't have to speak. You don't have to explain. But if there's something you want to let go of, write it down. And if there's something you want to keep, write that too." By midnight, the notebook was full. Later that night, Helen sat by herself in the lantern room, watching the stars reflect off the waves. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was carrying someone else's story. She felt whole, not because the pain had vanished, but because she had invited it in, sat with it, and let it become something beautiful. A few weeks after the New Year, a young woman arrived at the Lighthouse. She was quiet, shy, no more than 22. She introduced herself only as Mira. She didn't ask for a tour. She didn't ask for help. She simply said, "I read about what you've built here. I was wondering if you'd teach me not how to run a lighthouse, but how to hold space." Helen tilted her head. Surprised? "Hold space." Mira nodded. "You're not a therapist. You're not a preacher. You're not here to fix people, but they heal around you. I want to learn how to do that." Helen paused, then smiled. "Then let's begin with silence." And together, they sat. No instructions, no formulas, just two women, across generations, breathing the same salt air and learning what it means to stay. That spring, Helen wrote the final entry in her open journal. "For most of my life, I thought the light belonged to someone else, to my father, to the past, to the idea of who I should have been. But now I know, it's been mine all along. The light wasn't in the tower. It was in the choice, to stay, to forgive, to keep the door open for someone else who needs it. That's what light does. It doesn't demand, it doesn't rescue, it just stays on." And the light at Montgomery Bluff stayed on. Through fog, through storms, through stories that arrived crumpled and broken and left a little straighter, a little softer. Because one woman, a retired hospice nurse who bought a lighthouse nobody wanted, had decided that maybe healing doesn't come in grand gestures. Maybe it comes in small ones. A cup of tea, an open notebook, a quiet room filled with old pain and new hope. Helen Montgomery never asked to become a lighthouse. She simply refused to be a shadow. You don't have to be whole to hold the light. Helen Montgomery didn't move to Port Orford to become a symbol. She wasn't chasing legacy, attention, or healing. She came with silence in her suitcase, silence inherited from a father who disappeared, and a mother who filled the void with carefully folded lies. But in restoring a forgotten lighthouse, Helen discovered something she never expected, that the broken places in us aren't where we end. They're where light gets in. She didn't fix people. She didn't preach. She simply stayed. She kept the door open. She lit a small flame and let others gather around it on their own terms, in their own time. Her story teaches us that even when we feel unworthy, even when the past threatens to define us, we still have something to give. A space, a presence, a light. And sometimes, that's enough to change everything. Because the truth is, you don't need to save the world. You just need to stay when others leave. And keep the light on. The end. Up next, 2 more true stories that will restore your faith in humanity. Click to keep the light going, and don't forget to subscribe if you believe broken things can be beautiful again.